this web page is a simple HTML file that includes a form. The form is not functionable. There is no meaning for form process.php. There isn't any file in this name in our code sample. It's not the point here, but usually, of course, you will create a form fully functional that its action attribute is assigned with a name for a PHP file or a URL address for a PHP file, or it can be anything developed in other alternative technologies such as JSP file or ASP.NET, etc. Now, when I start, well, in the beginning you see just a username and a text field. Now, when you start typing, you can see that as I type, I get over here a text saying that the username already exists or not. If not, then I just see 3 points. And as you can see, there isn't any refresh. Everything is very smooth. I just type, and just as I type, the text over here changes accordingly if the username already exists. You can imagine that there is some sort of database with a table with all users, and the code running on the server side just check whether the user name that was entered exists or not. Let's go over the code. The code sample includes sample.html and sample.php. Sample.php is a simple PHP script. You can imagine that it could include code that works with a database, but in order to keep it simple, I just have an array with usernames that already exist. And when this PHP script is executed, I mean, when I call it directly, and I can do it, just specify the name and pass over a query string with the parameter username, the response we get is either simple HTML code that displays username exists in red, or if I pass over a username that doesn't exist, then we get back just 3 dots. Now, if you take a look at the PHP script, then you see that first I check whether a username parameter was passed over, was part of the request, and if it is, then the response is what the check function returns. I pass over the username that arrived. Of course, I take over redundant spaces, and then I pass it over to check. And check is a function that simply checks if the passed over text already exists in the array we use, and if it is, then inArray returns true and the client receives this code. If the username doesn't exist, the client receives this code. Now, what happens here in this code sample is that the request, the HTTP request passed over to the PHP script is done in JavaScript in a very smooth way known as Ajax, without getting the feeling of some sort of refresh as we are used to when we create simple forms. Everything is very smooth, and the response is displayed, is rendered over here And if we take a look at the code itself, we can see that we have a div element with a very specific ID, and actually the content of this div is updated either with 3 dots when the username doesn't exist, or with the text saying the username exists, and it shows in red. Now let's go over the HTML itself. The HTML is very simple, and as you can see, we have a text field that includes the attribute onKeyUp, meaning that each time the keyboard key goes up, then this function is invoked, and the content of the text field is passed over to this function. Now let's take a look at check username function, a function that was defined over here. Before we explain this function, first let's take a look at the variable xhr. xhr is assigned with a reference for an object, an XML HTTP request object, or in case we're dealing with Internet Explorer, then this is the code that executes. Starting with the new Internet Explorer, you can also execute this code, but in case you want to support old Internet Explorer versions, then this is the code you need. Bottom line, xhr is assigned with a reference for an object in JavaScript we can use to send an HTTP request to a URL address, and we can also handle the response, getting back the response we receive back from that server side. So let's take a look at check username. The first thing is calling the abort function on the xhr object, the object we created, an object we can use to send an HTTP request. So if there are any previous requests that are still taken care, we abort all of them because they are not relevant. As you can see, each time the key moves up, check username is executed. We are not interested in requests sent to the server side referring a text that is no longer relevant, because if the user enters a text key after key, then we are interested just in the last text. We are not interested in the shorter text, in the text that was in the text field just a moment ago. So any previous requests are cancelled. Here we actually configure the xhr object. We specify the HTTP method we want to use when sending the request. We specify the URL address the request will be sent to. In this case, the sample.html and sample.php are located in the same folder, so I can place a relative URL. In any case, there is a security restriction. You can use the xhr object to send an HTTP request only to the same server from which the HTML file in which the JavaScript code is executed has arrived. So you must keep the same files, the same two files on the same server. So the URL address is actually composed from this text and the text that was passed over to the check username. So actually, when the user takes the key up, then the exact text in the text field is passed over to check username and is actually part of the query string, meaning it is passed over to the server side. True means that we want to work asynchronous. Over here, we assign the onReadyStateChange property with a function. A function we want to be invoked each time the property readyState change its value. When the response arrives, then the ready state property gets the value 4. So each time ready state changes its value, this function is invoked, and actually it checks if the response arrives. And if ready state is equal to 4, it means the response has arrived, and then we just update the div element we see over here with the response. Only when we invoke the send function on the XHR object, only then the request is sent to the server. It takes time, and when the response arrives completely, only then ready state is equal to 4 and this code is executed and we get the response on the screen.